I think what I have given as a printed paper is a very short distillation of some of my thoughts, and I will try to expand on some of what I've been thinking about it over the course of my career. So I would say for every person here, and there are a few young people and a lot of us who have been around the block for a little while, the India that we see today is very different from the India that I grew up in. And I would say for many of you, it is very different from the India that you grew up in. The kind of opportunities that people have, the kind of progress, both economic, social, however much we may want more and different, it still is a very different country from what we have seen as children. Despite this progress in key sectors, especially in the sector of, having, we don't hear about famines the way we used to when you were growing up, or impact of a drought quite the same way that when we were growing up. Despite this, there are many concerns that exercise both the government and our citizenry. And I would sort of categorize them. The most important of them, in my view, are things that arise from developing our human capital. We are a country where nearly 50% of the population is under 30 years of age. This is both an opportunity and a challenge. It is an opportunity because every place you read, for any economist will talk about the demographic dividend. However, it is also sets up a hotbed for social unrest if their hopes, dreams for the kind of life they want to lead is not realized. So, what can be a strength in a minute can be converted into weakness unless we, as people of this country, can create opportunity for them. Some of the things that hold back this kind of opportunity, in my view, comes from, yes, we don't have famine quite the way we used to, but malnutrition, especially malnutrition of young mothers, and therefore impacting her own children, is a serious limitation in just from the get-go for the development of human capital. It's important that this be addressed. My own colleague, who is just moved to as a director for CDFT, has started an effort called Arunda to sort of map and monitor the nutritional status of the country at large in a much more centralized manner, as is also being done in collaboration with CMC Vellore. But that is one example of where we as a society fall short in something as basic as making sure that our young people and young people who in turn give birth to these young people are supported well, have the health and resources to really develop our population to achieve the greatest heights that they seek to and we want them to. The fear from the government is one which you hear, for instance, from Rajesh Gokhale openly and from many other people much more quietly, is the fear that we will fall into the middle income trap. And the reason you worry about this middle income trap so much is that you will be like many countries which become rich enough but not truly rich. There are very, very few countries, I think about 13, which have made the transition from the middle income to the rich group. One of them is South Korea, but one of them was Greece until it crashed. So I would argue that as a nation and as economists and as scientists, we should be more concerned about the trajectory than necessarily the end point. Because the end point is something that can change according to the context. But if you develop good processes along with measurements, you as a culture will develop the confidence to solve your own problems. That's something which I fear India still needs to go some distance in. The greatest fear of the middle income trap, as I see it, is that the government as a whole, and I think to some degree thinking people, are worried that we'll become old before we become rich. Because currently, this is our population structure. We have a lot of young people. But if we don't make rapid progress, we're going to become like Thailand, where we have a lot of old people, not a lot of young people, but we are still not what would be considered a first world country. I would say that a very important driver of this kind of transition from where we are economically and socially to a place which is going to be significantly different. One driver, and I think a long term driver, is science and technology. In this, what is very, very important is that we take the path of not of imitation, but of innovation. If you remember the 80s in Japan, which has had a consistent, it's been the top 10 countries as percentage of GDP investment in science and technology. In the 80s, people would talk about Japanese science as people who could just do, little changes. They would be imitating what other people, all these wonderful Western world had set up these cool technologies, and all Japan can do is do some sort of derivative of it and make it work. I think people will be hard pressed to make that statement today. It also tells you how short sighted the view is when we use terminology such as innovation. Innovation comes in many forms and shapes. It does not always have to be new in an absolute terms, but it can also be incremental progress because incremental progress can make tremendous differences in everyday life. If you had a new rice variety whose yield increased by 2%, that 2% can probably feed a huge number of people if you plant enough of that crop. So I think we as a community need to be very careful about what we aspire to and what language we use when we describe our aspirations. Because when you use words such as, and it has been done in the past, we want true innovation, we don't want imitation, we don't want derivative science. When you say things like that, you immediately say something is better than some other kind of effort without ever asking the question, what is it that our society and our people need at this point of time? And the second thing, which has been a huge push from the government, and a very right push, because many countries which have made the transition from the middle income trap have walked the path wherein they have moved from largely agriculture to having strong sense of manufacturing or for providing back-end processing like that we do with IT. You could say a lot of IT industry is actually doing support work for truly innovative work is done elsewhere, but it has transformed our cities, it has transformed livelihoods. Now you have people who are working in IT. I think I was told that Trivandrum has changed tremendously. I can tell you that the Bangalore that I saw as a child and the Bangalore which is there today has seen change, and that has come from this sector, which you can say is, it's not truly scientific innovation, but yet made a very big change. So the long-term driver is certainly something which you should say is innovation, but we should not turn our back on all its manifestations that come into our daily life. I would urge us as citizens of this country to also be aware in our rush for prosperity to know what are the costs we are paying. Not only social costs, but costs that we take from the environment in wanting that third home, the fifth car, every child in our family having their own vehicle because they will not want to spend 10 or 20 or half an hour more taking public transport. Those are choices that we as people in society also need to consider. And I think it is this dialogue that needs to happen much more, in my view, as we move forward. Okay, so as I said, India has progressed, but there continue to be new worries as well as opportunities that we need to take care of. Let's move back to innovation itself. Which are the countries and which are the people who have always innovated? I would say that's an inherent nature of man. Man has innovated from the time he was hunter gatherer. Once he discovered fire, he no longer had to be afraid of the lion in the same way. He could torch a little piece of, the forest and keep them away. Once he learned that he could make something to cover his body, he would be able to not be at the mercy of elements around him. So, the inherent nature of man, which is driven by evolutionary processes and probably in turn selecting for certain kind of people. In fact, it's very that part of the exhibit yesterday was just marvelous. I wish I had a little more time to spend there. Innovation is inherent to human nature. However, what we are looking for varies from what is the local innovation and serendipity that occurs around us naturally. We want to speed that up. Have there been success stories in that? The top 10 countries which have invested as percentage of GDP in their economies have done so for decades before they've had any return. So far, I can say this with utter confidence, even in the narrowest kind of science that I do, if I define it in the narrowest way, we have absolutely no clue where the next big idea is going to come from. This is something we do not know, we have no prediction over. We can only set up good systems and processes and hope. I can say this even as a parent, and I'm sure some of you are parents here or mentors of young people. You set up good processes in hopes some magic will happen with that young person and they will discover something or they will do something with their energies and talents and time. But you don't have a way to create it. Serendipity is central to innovation, and serendipity has to be given space to exist. Serendipity and curiosity has given lots of things to us, which we use in modern life. Cisplatin. It was discovered as, it's a cancer drug, and it was discovered as something which controlled division of cells in E. coli. How would you even predict that something like that, which we're trying to use as a means to study cell division, could end up being so central to some of the cancer treatments? mRNA vaccines. There's Carico and Drew Barrymore, when they did the work, they couldn't even get government funding to do it. And I think everybody here knows this story. But that gave us the first major innovation in vaccine technology, where majority of the world is using the vaccine technology to generate vaccines, which was used for Covaxin, which is ancient, nearly 100 years old. Could they have predicted that we would be here today? Would Calico have predicted that she would get a Nobel Prize? I don't think anybody could have predicted that. And that is the power of letting things happen naturally by creating a good environment. Or genome editing. People who are studying genome editing in some little bacteria in a country called Slovenia, far away from being a powerhouse. That little finding was picked up by two scientists, one I can't Charpentier and Doudna, and it's very big. Now we're talking about fixing the genome of people who have genetic disorders and changing things. Right? You can't expect these things to happen because they happen by the side of what is curiosity-driven research. This is just but a handful of examples that you can come up with. There are many, many, many examples that you can come up with. One thing you should recognize is that any time the government or any government or people say that we should be funding India-specific problems or country-specific problems, or you should address local issues, I say yes, definitely should be done, but make sure that you ring fence some portion which is just for fundamental science. Because fundamental science is what has the chance to give you transformative innovations which we cannot yet imagine. And I've given you some examples over here. It's transformative, we cannot imagine it. Unless you give that little bit of space, you are not going to get what you want. Enough space, the right culture to move that forward. In that regard, I want to say, when you look at patents, right, these are the kinds of things government thinks about. Do we have enough patents from India? Are we meeting the metrics? Are we addressing our local problems? Our local problems can be pollution, or one example could be, when people go to all these dhams, which is an example Rajesh Gokhale gives, very important problem. They leave several tons of saris after taking a ritual bath, which has to be cleared up and can clog the river, or any number of things. We can all think of local problems that we have which need to be solved. Or what I recently learned, there's a lot of jackfruits which grow in Kerala, but we don't have processing plants. That India might be importing coconuts from Thailand instead of using the coconuts which are over here. Why would you even, these are all our local problems which have to be solved. But there is also space, if you want true innovation, to protect fundamental science. I would say there are cultural similarities between both innovation in fundamental areas and innovation that take place to solve local India-specific problems. And the central cultural innovation, and I will just come to it, elaborate on it a little bit, is one where you're willing to take risks, where you're willing to fail, and have the resilience to pick yourself up and try again and fail better or succeed. I should say all of these things is predicated on having sufficient human capital. And all of this innovation cannot take place if we have a minuscule human capital, which I would say is what Indian science and technology sphere is. We have a very small number of people who can engage in this activity. And that is one very big central driver which has to be changed for us to see the big changes that we want to see. Enough number of people have to do it, and we have to ring fence some portion of it for truly fundamental research. Once we have that culture, we can expect innovation both in science and from science, which are overlapping. Innovation in science, and I'm a fundamental neurobiologist, I don't work on anything which is to do with directly applicable to the public in any shape or form. Innovation in science comes from addressing new problems. There are frontier problems which are there. I mean, you can look at human life and say, no, we don't understand what consciousness is. We need to understand that problem, and maybe that problem isn't ripe for solution now. But at some point it might be. So it comes from addressing new problems, taking new approaches. I can tell you in neurobiology many such new approaches which came in, new techniques. And these together lead to conceptual advances in science itself. And there are examples that we can give over here, and ones which you will be familiar with whatever is your domain of expertise. Be that physics, be that engineering, be that biology, be that chemistry. Each of these areas you will be able to think of examples over here. The innovation that arises from science is the things which I talked about, like mRNA vaccines, where we use conceptual and technical advances and have a path for societal benefit. And that path in societal benefit, and I will say this again as I said earlier, incremental progress can have tremendous societal benefit. As has happened in the agriculture sector, as has happened in the dairy sector, Rather than changing our cows, maybe we had better practices, but it was a lot of it was organization, right? And here was a marriage of some amount of science with other elements, and the innovation came perhaps from science and people who were science adjacent and scientists, but that incremental advantages which you could get was then spread and led to societal benefit. So let's go back a step back, and I sort of alluded to what does innovation in science need? So the biggest and hardest change is culture. This is my personal view. Because true innovation requires risk taking. And there is nothing in the Indian education system which says, Beta, it's okay if you flunk. It's perfectly okay if you fail. It's alright if you spend 1 year doing random stuff. As long as you're doing something, you're not just sitting and watching some screen, but you are engaging with the world at large. True innovation requires risk taking. You cannot, for every success, every Elon Musk that you see who you think is very successful in whichever way, is not inventing new technology in all cases, but he's brought together good people. There are plenty of people who fail miserably and have miserable lives because of that failure. And the same holds true with every scientist. You try to solve a problem, hopefully you've picked the right problem. That's also sometimes can be debated, and people can say, what is this problem? It's a meaningless problem to study. It's somebody else's judgment. Your judgment could be this is the coolest thing under the planet to study. But the approach that you take may take you nowhere. Can happen. Does not make you a bad scientist. Just does not make you a worldly successful scientist. And there's a difference between the two. I would say it should be a virtue. Forget about it's just okay. It should be a virtue that you fail. I like to tell my students, if 50% of your projects are not failing, you're not being creative enough. You have to be creative to genuinely make change. And I think that's hard. We as a culture have to embrace it. Unless as a culture in India we embrace it, which means every parent in this room has to say it's okay if their kids are not in the same path. That they have not figured it all out when they are 15 years of age. That they have lined up all their ducks in a row and they're going to turn out in some way that you can talk about them. Or about yourself in the same way. That culture is something is not yet in our DNA. And in my view, that is the biggest thing which hampers us taking the big risks. And the fewest number of people, therefore, take these risks. And remember, just because you take the risk, you will not succeed. So you have to be okay with the culture, really, of failure. And so how does that translate, in my view, to education? And there are some aspects of ABP which I find interesting and I think worth engaging with. Let's have exploratory gap years. Let students go and try something new. There used to be a huge culture in India of Gurukula, where you would go and stay with the Guru. It didn't mean that you had to become a dancer or whatever, scholar of the same nature. But those models which have been part of our society are things that we should consider re-engaging with, which will give us a flexible workforce intellectually. People who do not necessarily view life as a series of steps to be accomplished towards a certain predetermined end. What else is needed? You can give a laundry list, and many people here, especially people who are engaging at the grassroots level, can probably identify very, many more. And here is a few things which I think are important. Good basic education. And Kerala is lucky enough to have it. Why can't other states? I think it's happening. It's happening everywhere in the country. Things are improving. Very different from when I was young. And it's marvelous. I mean, I feel sense of joy and pride that we have come as far as we have. Do I think we should have come faster and gone further? Absolutely, 200%, 2000%. But that does not take away from the fact that we have made progress. I would like a very strong science education focus. However, not at the cost of other things, because we are citizens of a country, which means we need to engage with all aspects of society, especially as we are getting our children through education system. And for me, doing science is doing less, not doing more. I don't want giant textbooks. I want them to do a few experiments and think about those few things that they're doing deeply. And that is going to require a huge cultural change. And I will come back to its value last in the last slide that I have. I would say again and again, STEM and scientists should not be divorced from society. And we do so much to sort of isolate this. In fact, one of the reasons I engaged when I have this, had this chance, when COVID hit, there were two parts I could do. I could start doing COVID research in my lab for short periods of time, and everybody and father and mother in this country, also in the rest of the world, started doing COVID research. And what I did instead, and I felt was more valuable, was to engage with the society in whatever way I could. And so took time to be part of a volunteer scientific organization as well as some large institutional organization to convey information. Because science is very, very muddled, very complicated. To speak to scientists, they will always say this, but also that. No policymaker can make decision based on three different things of this is probability, 40% this is probability, 30% this is probability, 20%. That's not the way you can make policy. It's very difficult for them. So you need people who can do that interface, knowing how to talk to people, both in society but also to policymakers. In fact, I would make a strong case that scientists should be included in many aspects of decision making. And not because they're super smart, it's because they're professional data analyzers. Two things will come because of that. You will insist on good systems and processes to collect data, keep data, curate data, and therefore have policy which is based on figuring out if something you're trying is working or is an emotional response that you think should work. Because I think there's a huge gap between what will work, your hope, what is actually working, and what has failed. And this is where scientists are professional data analyzers and thinkers, and I think this is the reason why scientists should be peppered in as many decision making places as possible. This also makes sure that this highly trained cadre are not just simply isolated in some ivory tower, but yet have that connection to society. The government during Vijayanagar's time, institutions started going out and sharing what I call science advertisement. What our institutions are doing to the public in certain fora. But I think it needs to go a way bigger step than that. In that scientists should engage with society fully, and that's when some number of scientists will be influenced and excited by the problems that our society needs to solve, instead of saying government is putting money in this, so I will try to work on this. That's not what you want, because then you're not bringing the best of that particular scientist to these problems as well. I've said this again, you need stable, hopefully high level funding. It's a shame that our country has not crossed even 1% of our GDP, whereas places like South Korea and Israel are doing 4%, and I think South Korea at some point was doing 7%. We need to ring-fence fundamental research and expand research across all kinds of higher institutions. Let us please not have routine practicals. Instead, get people to do one tiny project in their own college and get them to think about it. Science has the power to change the way people think about things, about their lives, about their decisions. And those are the skills we need to equip our nearly 50% population who are under 30 with, so that they can make a success of their life and therefore of our own country. I think inclusivity is a huge problem in India, where a very small sliver of the country gets opportunities, and more the people who can are even nowadays sending their young 18-year-olds abroad to get an education, which tells you that they are voting with their feet. They do not have the confidence that this country has the resources to train the next generation to kind of success that they would like their progeny to have. That's a damning thing, and that has to change by making it inclusive and making it good. And this is where those twin things, expanding research across all forms of higher education and inclusivity early, has the power to bring the social change we need. And as a scientist, I need ease of doing research to be improved. And so you don't apply standard government norms for all kinds of research related activities. For instance, Make in India. There is a place for it and there isn't a place for it, but this is not the place for that discussion. So what is my hope-filled perspective about fundamental research and research in general in India? I think it's growing, it's competent, it is doing good work, there is international recognition, it's still islands, it's still not a carpet, so we don't yet have enough people. This change has been driven by influx of good people, new people, relatively young, who have come to some of our newer institutions. And there have been some avenues of good, stable funding, typically with international practices. However, it is still tiered with haves and have-nots. Someone like me in TFR is better protected than someone in a central university, who in turn is better protected and is more stable funding and better processes than someone who comes from a state university unless they are lucky enough to be in one or two states of the country. This continues to hamper progress, and this is something as a policy decision I would urge state governments also to engage with. This is not something which should be left only to the center. But the center deals with a large and highly complex and very diverse country. You could almost say the North and South are two different countries altogether, and that argument has been made in a recently published book. Therefore, it is of great relevance to think about how are we going to tackle this have and have-nots in institutions and work in inclusivity of people if you want true social change. Let's come to the final thing. Next is my last slide, which is, should we be thinking about science and technology only from the perspective of economics? Is it just money? Is it just we want to progress economically and we want nation building? You know how excited all of us were when we landed on the moon. Oh boy, the enthusiasm level was so high. I have pictures in my phone of my entire lab dropping everything, me included, watching the moon. And this was across the nation, the sense of pride, the sense of joy, the sense of coming together. Is it that when we get some technology, when we get a big prize, this is what is going to happen? I would say the answer is no. And I will say this, it sort of came to me, I've always thought it, but it really came to me home when we were dealing with the pandemic. We live in complex times where simplicity and trust in information sources is marginal as best. There is so much misinformation and disinformation. And while, when I was growing up and when a lot of people were growing up, we had few trusted sources of information and we had local networks. Now we are plugged into a global network of myths and Maya coming your way. How are we and how are young people going to navigate this and still keep their enthusiasm and drive and positivity and desire to do something instead of feeling crushed and thinking everything is negative? What are our values as a society? Here is a picture of our preamble where we have listed very clearly and boldly and loudly. We want justice, we want liberty, we want equality, we want fraternity, and we've described each of those. Are these the values that we as a society have embraced? How can we commit to these values in the face of the complexity of information landscape that we have? And here's where I think science provides one clear, neutral mechanism to teach people have better decision making skills. I have written about this once before, and I will say this loudly and clearly. Neutral and the chance to develop decision making skills so that you make better healthcare decisions for yourself, so that you make better financial decisions for yourself, so that the next random information comes your way, you're not sold on it, and you stop yourself and ask, where is that coming from? Who is saying it? If this is true, what else will be true? Does it hold true? Does it even pass the smell test? We need this urgently as social beings. And it may well translate to other aspects of life too. But we need this as social beings who live in a very complex world. So, science, at its fundamental, divorced from what we want innovation, progress, the next big technology, the next big prize, going to the Mars gives you what no other person, no other way can easily be done without creating social turmoil, which is critical thinking. On that note, I shall end. Thank you for your time. Stable funding, the rest will follow.